Right. So last week was a huge week for AI, and we started out with Codex from OpenAI, and then we got tons of updates from Microsoft Build, including open sourcing Copilot Chat. And then at Google I/O, we got VO3, the video generator that has created an incredible amount of memes this week and last week. Plus, then we have on Friday the release of Claude, which I think is pretty cool. And I think we've reached some sort of pivot where companies are starting to focus more on maybe their own products and also with Claude, focusing on what they're really good at. So today I'm talking to Dennis Linkov. He's an ML lead at WiseDocs and also a teacher as well as a staff or an instructor at LinkedIn Learning, doing courses on AI orchestration and super popular content on GPT, Gemini, LangChain, all of which have probably been tossed up in the air and now are getting updated. So he really brings a great perspective on architecture, hands-on development experience with LLMs. So we're going to break down what's behind this shift and what it means for everyone building or using AI. So hello, Dennis. Thank you so much for coming. And I want to get your read on what you think is the most important thing that happened in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, so it's pretty challenging to pick a most important one. I think all the ones that you've mentioned have been super important. I think what's interesting here is that every company is starting to define its niche, right? So we had the updates from OpenAI on Codex. Then we have Anthropic going in a similar direction of how can we help automate the coding experience. That might be driven by how much money these coding tools for vibe coding or AI IDEs are making, right? With Cursor, Windsurfer, Lovable, and a number of other tools. So that's very interesting. Then you have Microsoft, as you mentioned, shifting Copilot to be open source. So that's another interesting strategy that would be unheard of 10 years ago from Microsoft, right? And then we have some interesting model developments as well. There are some cool papers that came out on reinforcement learning earlier this week and model training to at lower precisions that allow us to train models faster on GPUs. So depending how you slice and dice it, there's always something new, and it's almost impossible to keep up. So you have to know what kind of question are you asking to get the right answer. So.
Yeah, I think there's so much to pick from that it was really hard for me to focus on one thing. I think that it was easy at the beginning of the week or even actually the week before where we had OpenAI release their tool Codex, which I thought was super interesting. I don't know if you've had a chance to sort of play with it, but I thought that kind of set the conversation there. I've always said that Sam Altman has like a closet full of products and models. And he's ready whenever, and in my mind, they always go to a bar in San Francisco and they're all talking and they have spies somewhere. And then somebody tells them, hey, it's going to be the, Gemini plus a bunch of other stuff. And Sam's like, all right, like Iron Man has like all these suits that he calls upon. We need the Hulk Buster. I think Sam's like that, like release the Kraken model now, whatever version 2. And that's what happens. A couple of things that I thought were maybe interesting, and maybe you can comment on it, was this sort of new approach of diffusion models. What do you think about that? Because I'd seen that before, but not from a major player.
Mm-hmm. So diffusion language models were interesting. We actually covered it in the course that I was teaching, the LADA models. So I think we're going to see this crossover, right? So we saw a crossover from diffusion into language models. So Gemini diffusion was released, which brings the benefit of generating all the responses all at once. So you have higher coherence and it's faster. So diffusion traditionally has been used in physics modeling, then it came into image and video generation. And now we're actually seeing the opposite crossover as well with GPT-4o when it was released, or the image generation component was released as part of that Ghibli craze that the large language models can generate images as well. So we have these technologies sort of interweaving, right? They used to have separate lanes, but now they're crossing back and forth. So we're going to see some interesting architectures continue to evolve throughout this year and next year as well.
Yeah, I think so. And I guess we should probably like define diffusion. You mentioned that it's something that you had seen in other places, and then it's been around basically image generation models for quite a while. And so basically how these models used to get trained, or they're still trained like this, I guess, except for maybe GPT-4's now new image model, which is a little bit different. The way that those models are trained is by taking images and adding noise to them and then learning how to undo that noise. And that's how, through the sort of undiffusion, they also learn to align the images that you're asking for in the prompts to sort of adhere to the prompts that you're asking about. So if you've ever used anything like Midjourney, you can actually see this happening where you ask for an image and you get like a blob, and then the blob gets a little bit clearer. Sort of like when you're driving around and you're seeing like maybe there's a lot of fog on the road and you kind of see the fog dissipate and you see kind of the actual image. That's kind of how I think about it. But now we've got these models that use this technique, and we saw one of those was an announcement from one of the big players that now they're thinking about bringing that into regular models, like coding models, I think specifically, but we've seen it with textual models as well. And basically what would happen is instead of trying to generate sequentially like most models do, like when you use a base model, you're basically it's almost like the model is typing things out. You are basically now able to sort of diffuse multiple pieces at the same time. It appears, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears to be almost like, parallel processes. So you get more things happening at once than not. And potentially this could be like this humongous speed up of the sort of the process of getting a result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the diffusion way, we map some kind of noise. It's a little bit magical, right? Because we had this. So diffusion has the two parts, as you mentioned. You have the forward process where you convert images, add noise to them to get some noisy background, and then you go backwards, right? So you go from noise into some image, which is pretty amazing, right? That whole process is very cool. So each time step, each pixel becomes clearer and clearer, or in this case, each token, as compared to traditional large language models, which are autoregressive, meaning that we start off with one token, and as you mentioned, right, you're sort of typing, and everything depends on the previous one. So rather than generating it all at once with some kind of guidance, or we used to generate it one at a time. Now we generate it all at once with some guidance. So it's very cool. The results aren't state of the art, but it's always interesting when we can do the same thing with different techniques.
Yeah, I think it's gonna take seeing it more in other places for me to be convinced. I'm not convinced that this is a good move. I've seen it in other places, but I'm not convinced that this is viable. I mean, the fact that one of the big three actually sort of is working on it was big enough to make me take notice. So we may see that sort of happening a little bit later on. So we can't talk about coding these days without discussing vibe coding and the revolution and the impact that that has had on the culture and potentially for developers as well. So really curious because you're very technical. What's your take on this topic? Are you doing vibe coding? Is anybody in your team doing vibe coding? Are students? Like, what are you noticing out there?
Yeah, so I think vibe coding is excellent for doing proof of concepts and bringing concepts to life. So one of the things whenever I built new products or new features is that we do a technical design and we want to be as specific as possible. So provide examples of what you're building. Let's say that we're building a food recommendation app, right? So if we're building that, we want to provide some mockups, we want to provide some sample data. We want to get to as close to the development experience as possible because we don't want there to be an opportunity to have some kind of misalignment, right?
Mhm.
Whenever there's a lack of clarity, right? If you work in the development world, you'll say, "Oh, this wasn't in the requirements." You might have heard that phrase, or "Oh, this didn't line up, or this wasn't clear," right? So the closer we can get from prototype or design to the working product, the better. So personally, I've used it as a way to demonstrate design documents and get people's feedback. So we say, okay, here's a new feature we're releasing. Let's code that up, make it clickable. We have no guarantees this code will make it anywhere. We don't necessarily want it to make it anywhere, but I want everybody to know that this is the prototype, and for us to be able to get to a source of common understanding, right? What we're building. So I found that very useful. And then just sort of the iterative process, I don't know if you'd call it vibe coding, but having the LLM generate some of the code, especially templated code, is very helpful. So I think it gets challenging when people are using vibe coding, especially for sensitive domains. I saw a LinkedIn post about somebody building a health application who wasn't technical and being like, wow, with vibe coding, I built this app for $100. I don't need to hire a dev team. And I feel bad if this was a true story. You can't always believe what you read on the internet. Any patients who are just putting their personal information into something that hasn't been verified. So we have to be very careful about it, because you vibe code your personal information into some bad places. So.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're in a stage where people are potentially, especially with the web being what it is, and also social media being what it is, where the sort of most outrageous posts do super well. So somebody's saying that, oh, I just built a whole health app or a 3D application, and it's fantastic, and some people are making money on it. But I think that those are what gets a lot of attention. I personally love it because of a couple of things. Of course, it does prototype pretty well, and I think some of the tools are better than others. Like I did a course on Bolt, which I think is amazing at getting you something workable quick, whereas like Cursor is more for professional developers. There's actually all these different ranges of vibe coding. I usually suggest that you start with what's already in ChatGPT or Claude, which will be like artifacts, or the Canvas tool that lets you kind of get an idea of what you're looking at. Even Gemini has this now. And it does a really good job of showing you something that then you have to work with to get it to be, in a different state. So I think it's really good for prototyping, as you mentioned. But the other thing that I love about it is that sometimes it shows you something you weren't thinking about. So you feed it data, and all of a sudden it shows you a chart, and you're like, wow, that's actually a good chart that I wasn't thinking about. So have you experienced that sort of thing? I mean, what's your take on how maybe people should be using it, and especially maybe not professional developers, but more in the beginning realm?
Yeah. So I think it's knowing what you know and what you don't know, right? So if you're a very skilled developer, you have your best judgment to know, like, what am I comfortable deploying? What are the promises that I'm making? I think this gold rush of people being excited can lead to some challenges. I think what's interesting from a product perspective is introducing this, what to call it, phase transition or handoff point, right? So if you're using one of these vibe coding tools, you have Lovable, you have Bolt, you have something else. Some of the recent features they were releasing was actually showing the code that you could check in or edit yourself, which I think is necessary, right? Because sometimes you need to verify what is going on in this application that I built, make some changes, or be able to interact. So, for example, have a non-technical or semi-technical user start building something, whether it's a designer, product manager, and so forth, and then it gets synchronized with the developers' Git repository, let's say, and then they can make changes and iterate together, right? So I think that whole workflow of design, product management, requirements, development is going to be much tighter, and always appreciate it when we integrate those things much more closely. We saw it a little bit with Figma, with dev mode. Figma is also starting to add some of the developer side as well, same with Canva. So we're seeing this merger across the spectrum, right? Starting with design tools, product management tools, agent builders, coding environments, and so forth. It's all sort of starting to mix, and we'll see how everybody defines their niche. So
It feels like a lot of these tools are going too far with code immediately. Like I feel like there should be a design step, and I think some of the tools are perhaps kind of trying to find a space there where why code the entire interface? That just takes a long time. Why not start with some sort of design step where you are maybe showing some of these things, but potentially just prototyping the design first and then letting people have more input? I feel like it would be faster. I don't know. And I'd love to see kind of more development in sort of that way as well. But I do think it changes the conversation in a world where your, sort of, beginning person, manager, or anybody can actually create something that is that far ahead. I think it kind of like now begins the conversations for to developers or for developers, just at a different level. Anybody can do this. Some things now, like build a dashboard from data. It might not be a product, but since anybody can do it, we're just like at a different level now where that's kind of the Excel of today. What's expected is people to be able to produce some tools that I think are pretty cool. So I think that's going to be pretty interesting to see where everything kind of like sits in the near future, if not already the present. So something else that's really hotly debated these days is what humans are going to be doing. So speaking of which, like in a world where everybody can vibe code, or we saw VO3, and that's something that just came out on Gemini. Really, sort of, I think they needed Gemini or Google needed a product that I think put them in everyone's mind, and they did it with VO3. ChatGPT did it for OpenAI. Claude had their artifacts moment. I think VO is kind of like the thing that now everybody's talking about that really makes people want to try, Gemini out. Although I think it's actually a superior tool in a lot of ways. So what's your take on how this changes sort of humanity? Was everybody going to be doing? How does like the introduction of these different tools now change the structure of how sort of things get done, especially in your world?
Mm-hmm. So a friend and I were having this discussion about should we be optimistic or pessimistic about it, not from a existential perspective, but from a productivity perspective. So
Mhm.
there's two directions we can go in. The first one is, are we going to be more productive because we can automate more work, right? So let's assume some people talk about AI making us 10 or 100x more productive. I personally think it's closer to 2x right now. Let's say 2x, right? So if we can be twice as productive, and we can do twice the amount of work, is that work going to be constructive, or are we just going to be generating documents for one another to read or have AI read or whatnot? Are we just going to take the existing process and fill the void with the time that we have? Because when computers were introduced, it's not always clear if computers or the internet, if things got better, right? If we think about things that we find frustrating, whether it's going to the dentist or filling out some paperwork or something else, has that gotten easier? In some places, yes, from 50 years ago, in some places, no, right? So it's a similar question here. Is the introduction of AI going to make things easier or just create more steps or paperwork to deal with it? So this gets even more interesting because in some domains that are heavily regulated or slower moving, I hope, but I can see it just creating more work, more work. People write longer emails, longer documents. There's more stuff.
Yeah, people are writing longer documents, and then there's the people creating the things to make the documents shorter, right? To
Exactly.
like digest documents.
But on the other side, in places that are more competitive or need that competitive advantage, a friend and I were talking about smaller countries, right, that have typically taken on more or lower regulation or more digitally friendly environment. Thinking countries like Estonia, for example, this might be a moment where they say, okay, this is a good reason to reform what we're building or what we're doing. As opposed to bigger countries who might not have that sort of economic pressure to say, okay, if everybody's 2 times more productive, how do I not get left behind? And likewise with startups, right? If a startup is 10 people versus a company that's 100,000 people, there's more pressure to innovate and actually leverage this rather than just creating more paperwork. So.
What about, I know you hire people and you obviously in a development company. How has this changed your sort of hiring workflow? And I know that you hire developers, but how do you think it's kind of affecting that world of how we acquire people?
So there has been a trend of hiring fewer junior people. I personally, well, personally, I think that's fine because there's better folks for me to hire. We hired, for example, this term, three interns on my team. We hire sort of across the experience levels. So for me personally, I think you get the right person into the job. Every age group generation brings something new into this, and we just have to hire for what's important. There is a pressure to say, oh, I've heard the saying of these LLM agents are as good as a junior developer, which I'm not sure that's true. or if it is true. Personally, the juniors that I've hired have been very strong, and I haven't seen that mismatch. So we have the opportunity to continue to hiring people. I think the training process, the assessment process will continue to change as LLMs can solve coding problems pretty easily, and the way that we build is different, right? So I think the shift is going to happen. Something that we do internally is we've been doing weekly sort of lunch and learns on some topics. How do we prompt? How do we use AI tools and so forth? Because the team has to keep up, and everybody can bring their perspective of the best practices they're using. So
Interesting. So you're also a teacher, not just at LinkedIn, but you also teach at the University of Toronto. And recently actually talked about your experience organizing the class. And we have a comment from Bhavani saying that educators really have no idea if they should be excited or paranoid. So how did you use AI? How did you how did the students use AI, and was that okay? Did you try to sort of go more traditional in your teaching, or how did you manage to kind of incorporate this into the class?
yeah, so I think the policy that a lot of instructors at the university have had is that students are going to use AI regardless, right? You can't get off this train. The train has left the station. You have to adapt. So you do see trends. I saw a tweet by a professor in Berkeley about this, and it matched my experience where students are getting 95, 98% on the assignments, and then they show up to the midterm or the final, and their grades are a lot lower.
Hmm.
So I think this is a trend that people are using large language models. Assignments do need to change, but it is a great way to study for the actual material is to work through it yourself. So students do themselves a disservice if they don't even attempt it, or if they vibe code the answer, right, but don't learn anything from it.
Right.
But one of the things we did change is that we introduced a paper reading assignment, and that was more of a we measured the output in a non sort of traditional coding way, right? You're not necessarily getting a right or wrong answer. You're doing some writing, you're reading, you're learning through that way. So that type of assessment is a little bit different. And the final output of that was an overview video for 5 minutes. So maybe with VO3 that can now be generated.
Well, hold on. So
But
you gave him an assignment of making a video
yeah,
about that's actually smart, right? Because then,
about
I mean,
yeah.
up to now, like you said.
Yeah, about the papers that they read, some hypotheses that they had, and sort of synthesizing that together. So definitely, even in the Gemini course I'm re-recording now with deep research, I'm like, wow, okay, I can produce a report on. I think the assignment is on world wonders, right? I can compare two world run blah, 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 two world wonders. I'll say that fast. Two world wonders, and write a report about it, and Gemini and other models can generate a very coherent, cited report, right? So that's out the window. You can do that in 5 minutes, get something that resembles A work. So I think it's now either in-person assessments that you do to test knowledge, or just project-based learning. And a lot of countries around the world, especially in Europe, have been doing a lot more project-based work. So I'm hoping that we learn from that in the U.S., Canada, and other countries on how we can incorporate it, because it matches much better in an AI world.
Yeah, I feel that is really brilliant. I sometimes do teach some classes, so I think that the ability of a tool to describe, I can feel like with deep research now you can create like a podcast of two people talking, so you could still sort of try to like juice it somehow with those tools, but still maybe an unedited sort of live talk about what you learned. I think that's really smart. And then what else would I do? I think projects. I mean, even to me, if they turn in a project, I'm going to tell them, I'm assuming you're using AI, or you're using, say, GitHub chat or whatever it is, Cursor. So it's not necessarily what the tool does, but what your approach was and how you complete, and what did you end up with? Like, is it a good product? Not so much, is it fantastic code? Maybe, I don't know, maybe you're looking for specific code things, but I feel like I would be more about what were you thinking, like making those decisions when you get something from the AIs. I feel like that's to me the difference between human beings and AIs, that we can AIs just have almost like analysis paralysis. They have every option in the world, and they'll give you a reasonable option that maybe looks good, but there's something not quite right about it, or it isn't what you were looking for. So I think that perhaps, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, like maybe the ability to make those decisions, it's really what separates us. What do you think is going to be maybe the difference between what AIs end up doing and humans end up doing?
hmm So I think right now it's the creation or curation problem, right? So before, people needed to create, and we didn't have automation in some areas to do that, right? Whether it's visual arts or video, or music, but now we have the systems that can make it for us. So now it's a curation question. And how do we easily edit, or change or synthesize that information?
Hmm.
So I still think that that problem will continue to evolve, and we'll continue to go to the curation question. Now, typically, curation has been something that you did after lots of experience, right? So you'd hire a consultant or somebody to assess something. You'd hire somebody senior, who had a lot of experience about that. Now we're asking people, even children, right? You're growing up, and you're playing with ChatGPT. Let's say, I don't know what age people start to do that. Let's say you're 5, and you want ChatGPT to write you a poem, and you're iterating through that. That's a very different learning experience than asking a 50-year-old professor, right, on poetry to assess something. So I think it'll create something very interesting. I think to the other point, I did write a LinkedIn post about this on, would people actually like to use AI if the expectations were higher, right?
Mm.
So I think a lot of students loved ChatGPT when it first came out because professors, teachers did not really know about it or understand it, sort of that December holiday exam time in 2022. But if the expectation of you went up 10x, and if you just produced a report that was fine and you suddenly got a D minus, right? That I don't think people would be excited about that. Same with work, right? If at work suddenly you have to be 5x more productive, however you measure that, or 2x more productive, I don't know if people would be excited about it. So I think there's an asymmetry right now with power users and others, and while institutions, and sort of other parts of the world catch up, right? We have this asymmetry, but once it happens, if you go into a class and your teacher or professor is like, okay, I know this can be done in 5 minutes. Let's raise the bar, right? Suddenly students might not be as excited, and they'll be like, okay, just give me back pencil and paper. I'll just do this standard problem. So
Interesting. So yeah, I think Angela asks about sort of the business aspect of it, and I think you kind of touched on it. I believe I read a report that last year was the year with everybody where everybody was using the tools, but they weren't telling anyone that they were using them. So in businesses, a lot of individuals were using ChatGPT, but they just didn't tell anyone. And this year, the difference is that the businesses are now expecting their employees to use the tools to become more productive, and that changes it basically, what you were talking about when people are in school, and now there's a different expectation. Then you're going to have to perform at a different level. And are you ready for that? I think some people are ready, some people are not. With honestly, with the pricing of some of these tools, it's ridiculous how expensive they can get. But what's your take on sort of the business aspect of how this affects potentially product or business analysis or those kind of things?
I think it goes back to that original question, right? Is everybody going to be writing 100-page white papers that nobody is reading, right? um, because usually for, I think, a lot of companies is a question of focus and getting to the right metrics, right? So we don't necessarily need something super comprehensive, right? I've seen companies, organizations, governments, nonprofits, everybody you can imagine commission these reports, and then you look at the view count and it's like 10. Or sometimes you do an experiment, right? Who actually has read this document? And people give it, like, let's say 10 thumbs up in Slack, and then one person has actually read it, and then nobody left a comment, right? So it goes back to that expectation of how are we engaging with this analysis? Are we just producing pretty charts or metrics for the sake of it, or are we actually going to do something about it? So I think that'll be a big measure for that.
All right, let's get into your personal stack for working with AI. What do you use? How is it changing your life? And I'm not talking about your developer world specifically. We'll get to that. But how is AI generally affecting your overall life, like in and out of the office?
So from a personal perspective, it's one of those things you ask people working in a field, how much do you use something, particularly tech? And in my personal life, I do not use a lot of Gen AI.
Okay.
I think the most common thing I've done is some image generation, sort of for various personal events or whatnot. It'll be like, can you generate an image of, I don't know, a cat or something playing with a ball, right? Or a cartoon or something. But that's
I got to tell you though, Dennis, you got to level up your game on your personal life a little bit. If all you're doing is generating cats, I think you gotta spend some time there. But anyways, keep on going. Sorry to interrupt.
yeah. So for me, I mean, most of the personal time, there's not as much need for technology, I would say. Like
Mhm,
the if we look at what features I use even on a phone, right? So
mhm,
I have
mhm,
my phone here. What do I actually use it for? I message people, I call people, I send emails, I take pictures. That functionality in phones hasn't really changed in 15 years. I now have some AI on my phone, but I don't really use it.
mhm,
I set alarms, right? So I use like five very basic things. The smartphone I had many years ago did all the same things generally. So
mhm,
from a technology perspective, I think this is my general view on the world is for a lot of problems we have in the world, maybe 95% of them, the technology is already there to solve them. So I don't think technology will solve some of the challenges we're facing. Like we have a loneliness epidemic, right?
mhm,
People aren't
mhm,
making friends, they're not interacting as much. Um, I think from a being connected perspective, we've had the solution for that for 15, 20 years. I can message anybody I want in the world right now through technology, but it's a question of those in-person interactions, staying connected with people, having good relationships, right? I don't think that AI or technology in general will necessarily benefit that. I think we've hit sort of that threshold that we need. So.
mhm. I think the one thing that I use it for all the time, I have to do a lot of writing
Mhm.
and preparing coursework, and I imagine you teach and you do that as well. So I do use it a lot for that, but I never have it do the work for me. I have it become sort of part of the process, especially when it comes to brainstorming. Whenever, for example, I begin a project, usually say a short video, I try to get it to help me with come up with a good hook for the beginning of the video, and I'll say, give me 20 ideas. I feel like the brainstorming part is one of the most useful parts. The deep research part is definitely now, usually to do any work, I have to give the tools, the chatbots or whatever I'm using, a lot of context. And doing deep research is a great way of looking for things. So I can say something like, all right, I'm doing a course on this. I need to get some stats
Mhm.
for how the industry is changing. Say developers are, becoming more productive. Go find me all the research, and I just hand that off to like deep research and have it
Mhm.
absorb that. Or with Gemini, for example, one of the ways that I love using it is in just querying YouTube. That's one of the great strengths, that you can just say, okay, I remember I watched the video with Dan Brickling talking about the development of the spreadsheet, or Steve Jobs
Mhm.
was talking about something. I don't remember where it is, but I want to be able to refer to it and potentially link to it and give people that reference. I feel like that's really, really useful. That YouTube sort of connection, things are connected to docs. I think I'm afraid mostly of when these tools are going to be able to just turn on and look at what you're doing and just immediately assist you. I think that's
Mhm.
coming very soon. Google Gemini's developers tools actually already do this. They have a
Mhm.
section under stream, and you can turn that on and you can say, look at my screen and help me with the spreadsheet. I think that's coming. That's really going to be another, I think, tectonic shift in how we use the tools. But I think that if you find some of the ways that the tools can be almost like a collaborator with you, I think that's a really strong way of kind of integrating. They use I don't know, what the tools are really good at in providing a lot of options. So let's switch over to the developer world.
Mhm.
You teach a lot of models, you teach a lot of ML. What tools are you using? What would you recommend? Maybe some of the things that you should stay away from. What's your take on maybe Claude 4 versus Gemini? There's a lot of sort of conversation right now about those.
Yeah, so for development, typically use Cursor and then some of the in-application or in browser settings for Gemini, Canvas, OpenAI Canvas, Cloud Artifacts. So depending on what I'm doing. So using that, I think it's depending on the task. Like I use a lot of LLMs for generating mock data, right? That was a challenge that we had before sort of AI revolution. There's a number of different sort of smaller things that I do, and you have little libraries and such. But I think it's just constantly it's its own job to try out all the new tools coming out, build with them. I haven't done it professionally as much for the dedicated vibe coding tools, just some personal projects. But I think at the end of the day, it's understanding what code you need to write, what problem you're solving, because it's very easy to get lost in the I'm vibe coding for 8 hours a day, but what did I actually get done? So yeah, and with specific models, I think it's interesting. We touched on it earlier, but the Claude 4 generation seems to be focused on coding. Same with GPT 4.1 as well, coding and reasoning, math and such. So for other tasks like summarization or entity extraction or other traditional ML tasks, they're not making the same progress that they used to. So this goes back to that question. I made a post about this, is that have we hit a wall, or is it a business optimization where we can grow revenue 10x faster if we just target coding models and development, or maybe it's some kind of PR goal as well. So it's always hard to know because organizational priorities are so different. So it's hard to say, but I do think that in some ways these models are slowing down in some regards. But it's sometimes hard to see unless you have specific tasks that you're evaluating them on. And those are always interesting to see what people post online saying, hey, I had this problem. These models couldn't solve it, but Opus 4 solves it, or Sonnet 4 solves it, right? Or other people saying, hey, I had this problem. It looked cool, but nothing was solved, right? So it's really important to have your own sort of test cases and validate the models yourself. So.
I think it's interesting what you said. I find that you have to know what you're trying to get the model to do and then what the limitations are. So if you're generating, say, data, then Gemini has the largest sort of context window you have access to. So if it's large amounts of data, that could be pretty useful. And then you have to take a look at the price performance sort of ratio. If you're building an app and you need to use AI in the app, then something like O3 Mini or perhaps like Gemini Flash, like some of those models are going to give you the performance you need at a price that will make sense when you're creating an app that you're multiplying. So I think that's one of the things that the sort of standardized tests that everybody touts when they release a new model, they don't really capture those things. And those are some of the things that you should be sort of aware of when just working with models. I think I've always said if I were to build something, I'd probably use Flash, but that's been changing with even Grok becoming like a viable model because it is really, really inexpensive. So one of the things that was interesting to me about this new OpenAI sort of Codex announcement was, and I don't know if you've tried it, but basically so far we've had like chatbots inside the code editors, right? Cursor does this and other tools do this. But the one thing that they did that was different was that they generated basically a hub that sits outside the GitHub, right? And it basically lets you manage all kinds of things. And in the same way that what surprises me or what I find interesting about the vibe coding tools is sometimes they give you answers you didn't know that were there. What I loved was the first thing that I did was point the codex at a repo, and it found like all these typing errors that I never knew were there. Like, and so it did something that was useful. And then as I continued to use that, I found that when I told it to do something more specific, it would still sort of find things that I wasn't expecting. I don't know if you've used Codex, but they really develop more of a hub. And I think maybe that's a little inkling. I always think that what happens in development will then happen other places before. We're seeing like a lot of talk about agents Most people don't even know what that is. It seems like it was just what we used to call custom GPTs, like amped to another level. I know your tool does a lot of orchestration. I think that, what do you think about this sort of approach of generating something outside sort of the traditional set of developer tools?
Yeah, I think so. It gets pretty interesting. So it goes back to that sort of convergence of productivity suites. So typically, when we're building something, we start off with some kind of project management or documentation tool, right? We define our requirements. And this is almost a hub to do that. I've seen similar functionality in GitHub saying, okay, I have a list of issues. Can I get a model to go through and try to solve it, open up a pull request, and so forth? So this is pretty interesting as a concept, is saying, okay, I'm starting with my overview, whether it's a hub or a command panel and whatnot, and I can have different tasks. So I can imagine in the future, right? We have a view where it's these are my development tasks, these are my marketing tasks, sales tasks, and so forth. And similar, you can assign what the tasks are being done through atomic pieces, right? Because if we're generating, let's say, 100 ads and we want to generate 100 variations, we want to keep track of what's happening there. We don't just want it to be living in some tool, right? We want it to synchronize and say, hey, everybody, I've created this task. I sent it to the model to do. Here are the first 100 iterations. Can somebody review it, provide feedback? And then we can decide, okay, is the next step for a person to use it or for models to continue iterating? So I do see that this goes back to a lot of enterprise questions, is that how do we share information? How do we communicate better? That's kind of a core crux, that the user experience will continue to improve to allow better collaboration and better choice on where we're using automation versus human insight for this.
Yeah, I think we're going to get to a point really quick where the tools are going to have access to more information than humans have. So the ability of the tool to sort of surface things that you potentially weren't thinking about is going to be really interesting. I think that's kind of what I'm getting from Codex. I mean, with GitHub, Copilot, chat, you create the issue and you're very explicitly telling it, here's the things that I want you to do. When I first use Codex, all of a sudden I'm noticing that it's telling me things that I wasn't thinking. And in the business world, I think what's going to happen is there's this concept of dark data and data science, where there's data embedded in your business sort of information that you don't even know it's there. I think these tools might be able to surface some of that data. And then I think that what we're going to end up being able to do and being able to sort of act on will be even more interesting once we sort of unleash the tools on what's actually available for them to do. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other thing is just, right, so let's say that I'm a company, I'm working on a product, Codex or something else comes back and makes 20 changes, right? Suddenly there's a difference between my context. I'm now catching up on what the model has done. And that context shift or lack of understanding potentially might cause issues further down. So I might have potentially improved the typing, but suddenly there might have been a small change, right, that the model made, or the code base looks slightly different. So I might be less productive about things that actually matter, right? And I think one of the things why that I'll be giving a talk on sort of hiring and building AI teams, but one of the really important points is that managing context is so important. So you still need people to manage context. For example, for a code base, you need some context to make it work. Documentation helps, recording videos help, asking an LLM how does this work helps. But at the end of the day, to solve a really hard bug, you need to know things really, really well. So you need to have enough people to have enough coverage and context to be able to keep improving and iterating. It's sort of, if you were hiring people every 3 months and sort of churning them out, I sort of see that similar to large language models, just given the limited context window effectiveness for a lot of tasks. So.
All right, another geeky debate people are having is this concept of open source versus closed source. I have no idea on this. I go back and forth. Like, one of them is going to rule no, some of the stuff that's happening in closed source. Like, why is so much of the innovation happening in closed source systems? Honestly, just what's your take on it? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think closed source, So even though we had closed source models before, once the economic potential became clear, a lot of companies stopped publishing, right? So OpenAI doesn't really publish research papers or the innovations, right? So from a technical perspective or even a business perspective, not very open, closer to closed AI. And as a knock-on effect, Anthropic stopped publishing as much, Google stopped publishing. So we have this sort of little internal information war, right? Even researchers saying, hey, we included a cool new technique, but we're not going to tell anybody about it, right? That happens. So the other thing is we think about pricing and competitiveness. When Llama 1 came out, people were so excited. It originally had a very restricted license, but people were for lack of a better term, pirating it, right? Copying it, trying it out, using it for commercial reasons, because it was the first model that sort of hit a certain standard in the world. Then Llama 2 came out. That was sort of, I would say, the revolutionary point from a access perspective. Llama 3 was a really good improvement, and now we have the DeepSeek models. So it's hard to know as a counterfactual. Let's say we never got Llama, right? Or we never got DeepSeek, right? Where we would be if the competition between the big research labs would be enough. But just from like a science advancement perspective, something has changed dramatically since, I don't know, you can pick a date, 2020, 2022, with large language models, but we don't necessarily know what that was, right? We still don't know how OpenAI got GPT-4 to be as good as it was in 2022, right? How is it such a good model that for a lot of tasks, it's still sort of frontier, right? Right now, 3 years later, when so much has happened. So I think for information, for advancing science, I think it's really important. I think from a bad actor perspective, that's usually the argument against open source. People will get access to things. I think it's really a question of what information do large language models have that the internet doesn't. I think that it's almost companies propose opposite arguments for this, right? Sometimes they're like, LLMs have the information of the world, so we can replace search with them. At the same time, they're saying, actually, we want to make sure it doesn't have enough information on certain topics, right? So there's a little bit of tension there of what the argument is. But I think open source is really important, that the techniques that we're using to develop these models is really important, and that if there's offshoots, right? Imagine if there's a model that could provide you medical advice, right? That was really, really, really helpful. It's a question of should everybody have access to it if they want to, or do one or two companies dictate, right? What happens if I want to ask this model a question, right? So, yeah, I'm very much on the open source side, but from a business model perspective, it's important that companies can still earn money, but that doesn't have to be necessarily at the model level. It could be at the application level or vertical level, but that's a whole nother topic for
which goes back to, I think, the thing that we're talking about, which is the shift that we're seeing. Like, companies are changing, as you mentioned. I think we started out with models that they thought the bigger we make them, the better they're going to be. And then they discovered that you could have them like reason through things. And that became kind of interesting. I think the newer thing is that now models can use tools during their reasoning. Potentially this diffusion architecture could be something interesting. And I'm sure there are things that we haven't even seen before. But to me, clearly, what's more important nowadays is, how do you, what are the features that you're giving people? Like, what are these models doing? Sure, there's going to be like the models that you release to give other people the ability to generate things, but what the models are doing and, what they're good at is what makes them great. Also, it's interesting that some companies like Google, Microsoft, they choose to release or have closed source and open models. And then, but I do think that even if it's just for the disruption aspect, like the DeepSeek moment that we saw, you need to have people working on things that are going to just push everybody forward. I think DeepSeek was probably a good example for that. So next up, we have GPT-5 coming up. you just finished updating your course on GPT, so probably they're going to wait until you leave the recording studios to drop it. So, what do you think, OpenAI? Now that we've seen everything that Microsoft, Anthropic, and Google, they put their cards on the table. What do you think GPT-5 has to do to really be something interesting?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to the question on who is the target user, who are they trying to impress, right? So, for example, with the image generation that came out, it was impressive, but it seemed to be targeted as almost a growth technique, right? Get as many
Hmm.
users on board, release something kind of controversial by using another company's IP without necessarily asking for it, get people on board, get sort of more signups for ChatGPT, right? So that model release, that capability probably was there for a number of other companies, right? Google, I think, certainly has that capability, but this was just better marketing, right? And for the company lifecycle, they don't always have to release the best model. They can release sort of just enough to keep our attention on it, right? So if we have attention, right, we're going through time, right? Our attention might be slowly going down when other people are releasing things. Oh, here's a new model, or here's a new feature, a new growth hack, right? And it could be for developers, it could be for executives, it could be for just average person using ChatGPT or another tool. And I think that'll continue, right? So for Claude's release, for Sonnet 4 and Opus 4, seemed that it was much more developer focused with the release, but maybe we will have a more general release later. So likewise, the companies now have voice mode. So Anthropic released voice mode recently for that as well. You have mobile apps versus APIs versus web app. OpenAI hired their new CEO of applications from
Hmm.
Instacart a few months ago. So that's also interesting. Like, what is everybody's portfolio? What is their goal? These companies aren't just 5 people anymore, right? Building models. There's their whole ecosystem plays that are being made. And then OpenAI acquiring Johnny Ive's startup, right, for $6 billion. Whole nother thing, right? So they could stick with the same models and just keep releasing other things, right? So
Yeah, just
uh,
when I think everything's settled down, somebody will do something. Like the Johnny Ive thing's really weird because 6.5 billion is no amount of chunk change. So they got to have seen something, but you're like, okay, what is it going to be, a puck or something? It's not going to be glasses, not a watch. They're going to want to innovate. So I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the GPT-4o new image generation model because that was marketing, but at the same time, it was technology as well. So we talked about diffusion for the longest time. We've had these image diffusion algorithms. This was something different. It was like an
Mhm.
auto-regressive diffusion engine. It was technology, but nobody would have paid attention if that's all it was.
Yeah.
VO 3 was technology, but nobody paid attention until they made it talk, right? So you
Yeah.
got to have like technology has to have like a component to it that makes it marketable. And if you can land on a moment like that GPT-4o image engine, generating like Japanese art style, or VO generating, like, I think the memes right now are all about like the conversations, like people interviewing people on the street, like the models pretending to be people,
Mhm.
or the models pretending to be somebody like you. Maybe this whole thing could have been done with just the sort of AI version of Dennis, or
Mhm.
maybe in the future it won't even be on the show. It'll be like just our two AIs talking to each other. I think that it's important for companies to generate those like perceptual shifts, but also like innovate in terms of technology as well. And I think potentially that's where we're coming. So thank you so much, Dennis. I don't think we have any other questions in the chat. So I appreciate you taking your time. I sure hope that I don't know if I want them to release GPT-5 before you leave recording like tonight, or just wait, give you a couple weeks after you're done. But good luck in your recording, and thank you so much for being here.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Ray.
All right, take care. We'll talk to you soon.